If I was to put together a list of things cyclists hate, I'm pretty sure that headwinds would be right up there near the top, along with inconsiderate motorists and vegan cheese. Nothing makes my heart sink more than turning a corner on my bike only to be slapped full in the face with a strong southwesterly. I feel like I'm pedalling away and just getting nowhere. It's like riding in treacle. Now, if you've been unfortunate enough to be riding a bike anywhere in the UK over the last couple of weeks, you'll know all about this. For those of you that haven't, long story short, we've been battered by 2 major storms within the space of a week. And while the hurricane force winds have eased slightly, it's still blowing an absolute typhoid out there, making cycling difficult to say the least.
You mean typhoon?
Yeah, that's a good idea. You put the kettle on and we'll have a nice cup of tea. Yeah, I just couldn't resist. As far as us cyclists are concerned, wind essentially comes in 3 basic flavours: head, tail and side. And aerodynamic drag accounts for between 70 to 90% of the resistance we feel when cycling. Basically, our bodies act like a sail for the wind to push against, and if, like me, you're fairly large and square, the surface area of that sail is going to be that much bigger and the effect that much greater. When it's a tailwind, this can be a distinct advantage, but by contrast, a headwind can sometimes turn what would normally be an enjoyable day on the bike into one long painful slog. This is also the thinking behind the tight lycra that cyclists wear. Essentially, it doesn't flap about. Baggy clothing just increases this surface area, and the drag it creates slows you down. What you lose in fashion points, you soon score back with improved aerodynamics. Windy conditions can sometimes mean that it's also cold, so make sure that anything you wear is windproof so that it keeps you nice and warm. So what else can you do when the wind blows? Well, fortunately there are 1 or 2 further measures that you can take to make things slightly more pleasant. The first thing I would suggest is to get an accurate weather forecast. In this day and age of apps and smart devices, there's no shortage of ways of learning about wind direction and strength. Even the humble weather app on my iPhone will tell me that. For something slightly more in-depth, there's a website called mywindsock.com that can not only give you very specific weather and wind forecasts for your chosen route, but it can also analyse your historic Strava data to show you the wind effects you felt on a particular ride. Looking over a ride that you've just done probably serves you no practical purpose in retrospect, but it might just make you feel slightly better knowing that it was the wind slowing you down and not the slice of cake you had at the cafe stop. Being aware of wind is also a safety thing. I know I've certainly ridden in winds that have been so strong I've been in danger of being blown over. Fortunately for me, one of the few advantages of being heavy is that I'm a lot more stable than lighter riders. For example, a few years ago I rode over the Pont de Normandy in France in fancy dress, would you believe, and the side wind was incredible. Lighter riders in front of me were almost blown off the bridge and into the Seine 200 metres below. Pretty scary stuff, believe me. Once armed with a decent forecast, the next step would be to choose your route with care. Put very simply, you will probably want to avoid exposed places like the Pont de Normandy and others such as coastal areas and moors where winds are at their strongest. Instead, look for routes that take you somewhere with a bit more shelter, such as woodlands or even built-up areas. It's surprising just how much shelter from the wind a few bushes and trees can provide. If you cast your mind back to your geography lessons at school, you may remember that wind strength usually increases during the day. This is because the ground heats up, the warm air rises and the cooler air moves in to replace it. So if you can, try to go out for your ride earlier rather than later in the day when the wind is that little bit stronger. Where I live on the south coast of England, we nearly always have a pretty constant southwesterly blowing. Knowing this is quite useful when planning my route, as I can do the old school trick of riding into the wind while I'm fresh and then take advantage of the tailwind to push me home when I'm not quite so fresh. An interesting note here is that this wind's last landfall before it hits me is the Flamanville nuclear power plant, again in France, which is only about 100 kilometres across the channel. On those days, I can genuinely say that my ride is nuclear powered. Sadly, we're all going to get caught up in a headwind at some point. It's unavoidable. If you're riding on your own, one thing to try is to adopt a more aerodynamic position. Riding on the drops will reduce your overall surface area and give the wind less to push against. If you have a slightly more manly frame, riding on the drops can be a bit of a challenge though. If this is the case, reducing your gearing can help. Sadly, it won't increase your speed. If anything, it will make you slower, but it will reduce that horrible feeling of riding through treacle. If you're out riding with some chums, you can always take shelter behind the rider in front. This reduces the wind's effect by around 30%, but for it to be most effective, you'll need to ride no more than half a wheel behind them. The further away, the less shelter you will receive. If you're a new rider, this can be a little scary, and even if you're an experienced rider, it helps if you know and trust the person in front, but you'll still need your wits about you. You'll also need to be careful not to overlap, as a sudden side gust of wind can cause a touch of wheels and one or both of you will be off. Remember though, if someone is kind enough to let you sit on their wheel, it's only good etiquette to return the favour by taking your turn on the front so they can have a bit of shelter too. Alternatively, why fight the wind at all? What is it they say? When the wind blows, some build walls while others build windmills. Now, while I'm not suggesting taking that literally, embracing the wind and turning the difficult situation of riding into a headwind to your advantage is a pretty wise thing to do. On the one hand, it will certainly make you a stronger rider and much faster when the wind does eventually die down. If you live in an area that doesn't have any significant climbs, it can often be the only way of building up leg strength. Similarly, if you're chasing Strava PRs or even KOMs, riding these segments on days when the wind is behind you might just tip it in your favour. The wind is not always our enemy. Like most things, we just have to see it for what it is and learn to live with it, and if we can, make it work for us. Yeah, I'm sure there's an obvious line in there somewhere about breaking wind, but that's too low even for me. Thanks for watching.